Hey guys! So today you and I are going to talk about corporate personas. So let's get into it. So the question in question was actually just a response to another question I had answered. Hi Frederick, can you elaborate a bit on your persona? Mine is usually just willing to help out and never making any accusations, throwing toxic remarks, or being elitist. Then again, I'm just a junior, so I would look only dumb with that kind of persona without actual skills to back it up. This is a great point. You have identified the difference in the sort of persona that you can adopt as a professional. So let us back that up a little bit first and tell you a bit what I mean by persona. So in a previous video and a few other times I've answered this question where I make the argument that for you to be able to work effectively in a professional environment, and it's not really just a professional environment, it's any environment, because I think we can all agree that in some situations, it might be perfectly fine for you to be exactly the way that you are and just talk and speak freely and be, just in a very relaxed state. And in some situations, you adjust your behavior a little bit to more suit the context. As you know, it's usually people make a difference on behavior that might be completely appropriate when you're at home lying on the couch with your friends or something like that, or when you're at a very fancy dinner with a lot of important people or things like that. It's the same deal. And as you can imagine, and probably a lot of you people understand, that is also true for a professional environment. You have quite a lot of professions where a certain way of behaving is necessary in order to work in, say, a restaurant or in the service industry and so forth. And we as software developers, we of course have a similar sort of thing. And practically everybody does, right? And so what I tell people is that, at least for me, because I used to be a little bit less conscious about this, and I'm not saying that that is wrong by any means. I'm saying that it has served me very well to create a bit of a persona of the sort of individual that I think that is easiest for me. Like, I'm not trying to be false or anything like that. I'm trying to just remember that I am in a professional environment now, and maybe telling jokes about stuff and so forth and being social, politically incorrect and so forth, which is things that I've been known to do in my private time with my friends because I like to joke around with them, might not be the best thing in a die-hard, super important meeting, for example. And so, to elaborate a little bit, my persona, as I call it, is Happy Donkey, which is just you could be anything. It's just the persona that I found to be the easiest for me to adopt, which sort of captures the main points that I try to establish with my peers when I work in a professional environment, and it's based on the Shrek character. And so the basic idea is that I try to remember smile, be genuine, like you try to be smile and be approachable to people, because I work with a lot of different types of people, and some of them are like super junior, and I have learned the hard, well, not necessarily the hard way, but I've learned very quickly that a lot of people might feel intimidated. And as you can imagine now, I'm not trying to toot my own horn here or anything that like that, guys, but just the fact that I have this little YouTube channel and that some people perceive me as being fairly knowledgeable in quite a lot of different areas, it is really intimidating for some people. Even seniors feels like that it's a little bit intimidating because it becomes a little, the sensation for them becomes that, oh, it's almost like a junior and a senior. Like, I am a senior just as another person is a senior, but my knowledge of an area might be higher than theirs in some situations, not always, of course, but just the fact that that happens is enough for them to get a little bit a little bit intimidated. Oh yeah, I can't really keep up with Frederick or things like that. It was the same thing for me when I was a junior software developer. I felt the same way, and since I am conscious of that, it's important for me to make sure that I feel approachable and that I use my emotional intelligence to mitigate that as much as possible, because that way they feel comfortable coming to me and asking for help and things like that. And then, of course, I try to remember that be a little bit less informed, which is basically my way of saying that even if you know the answer to everything, let other people have a chance to say something, even if you know what they're going to say, even if you know all these sorts of things. Like, don't dismiss them, because it doesn't matter to me if I am the person who comes up with the idea. It's only when I see that we can't make progress or so forth, and if I have an idea, I will try to communicate it. And then that brings us to the last point. I try to be like a useful sidekick, if that makes sense. So what Donkey in the Shrek movies, and what usually the main character versus the sidekick, the sidekick is just there to either provide comic relief usually, or a different perspective or so forth, and 9 times out of 10 it's just for comic relief or something like that. I mean, of course, I'm not cracking jokes as a sidekick in this regard. It's more a question of that I will offer my views on something, but I treat every situation as if I'm just the person here who is supposed to provide that extra perspective. And then, unless people put me in a position of authority, that's the only time I actually take the leap forward and say, okay, this is what we're doing. I hope that makes sense. So I don't force people. I'm not trying to win by forcing people to believe what I believe. I'm trying to give them an idea. And so, as in movies, as you can imagine, 9 times out of 10, Donkey in the Shrek movies has a lot of weird ideas and so forth that, is just there to create comic relief. But every once in a while he says something that actually makes Shrek in this regard really think about something. It gets him to understand that there is another way of thinking that he was not maybe so open to begin with. Exactly the same idea. And then they have another role that I pick up, which is a little bit more professional, which, well, basically that only happens when I am in a debate or a high stakes meeting or something like that, when it's very important for me to get my points across and actually be a little bit more professional and less, let's say, less approachable and warm and cuddly. And what I do in that situation is a little bit more to take on, well, the best way I can describe it is, imagine how Sherlock Holmes would behave. The basic idea is that when I have a high stakes meeting or a discussion with people who are either opposing a way of doing things or so forth and so forth, and the classic one is they have seniority, they're a manager, there's something like that. What usually has to happen in that situation is that, well, it's a little bit like Socrates as well. The idea that I'm trying to push is that I'm trying to tear down the illusion that this person is competent only because they have a certain role or a certain position within the company, or they have been here for a certain amount of years. It's super standard that, managers, who, if we want to change something about an architecture or the way of working or stuff like that, that people will just listen to the person who's been there the longest, or the person who has, quote unquote, the most senior energy about them. And what I want is to then I usually adopt a more questioning rhetoric, and that I can do because I have the knowledge to do so. You said, Junior, you would have a really hard time doing this, but I can, at this point in my career, do this, where I can start asking them, why do you believe this? Okay, you believe that for these reasons, and then I can start structuring arguments for them that makes them have to justify the reasons why they are making a certain decisions, or they're doing things in a certain way, and so forth and so forth. And if I do this correctly, it pushes them further and further away from that state where they are so certain about themselves. Like, they can still be like, usually this ends with in one of two ways. Either they get super angry, or they try to deny their own ignorance, usually. The best situations are, of course, when they realize that, yeah, actually there is a better way of doing it, or there is another way of thinking about this. It doesn't really matter which one happens. You have to be careful with this one. I have had many situations where this is where Happy Donkey helps. If you have a baseline of Happy Donkey, then people will still like you afterwards, because this can get really, really emotional for a lot of people. Because basically what happens is that people who are used to being the smartest person in the room are forced to come to terms with that they're maybe not the smartest person in the room all the time. Sometimes they are, but in this case they might not be. And what I want is for everybody else, ideally that they understand it, that there might be a different way of thinking here, but at least everybody else should see it. Because, as I said, in many cases, you will find this all the time, guys. Some technical decisions, like the language stack that you have and all this sort of stuff, it's not based necessarily on an objective thing. It is based on that the person who had the strongest opinion and just enough seniority mojo thought that this is how it should work, and their only justification is because they think that it's a good idea. And if you want to question them on that, you have to make other people realize that that is what's going on, that they don't really have a good reason for this, they don't really know best, and so forth and so forth. You have to tear that down so that other people will start to wonder, do you really know what you're doing? So what I want you to take away from this is that my persona, my corporate persona, is just a picture I have in my head where I try to remember that I'm in a professional environment. And here, even though I would love to live in a world where I can just be myself all the time, exactly the way I am now, luckily for me, I'm pretty close to a happy donkey even in my private time. But it's the same thing if you were to work in a restaurant or so forth. If you have to deal with a lot of different customers, some of them are going to be super, super nice, and some of them are not going to be so nice. You have to treat them fairly well, regardless of circumstances, within reason, of course. It's the same deal here. So mine is happy donkey, or like a more inquisitive Socrates, Sherlock Holmes type of character or something like that. When, as I said, when I'm in a situation where I have to tear down the idea that someone like that, as I say, that authority is the same thing as competence. That's really, really important when you want to change something, because a lot of times when I'm in different teams and so forth, I'm dealing with people who in many cases have a really strong opinion about how to do something. And if that's, as I like to say, if you are doing all the right things and like everything is working, everybody's just happy with your situation, then who am I to say that that's not the way to do things? The only time I have to do this is when things are clearly not working and they refuse to change anything about anything because they have decided that this is the way they're doing it. And then I pick up a persona which is more, where I show more of my own competence. And now I need to know, of course, better or so forth usually, or have to have some ideas at the very least. But the point here is that I go from being someone who's just trying to be approachable, smile, be a little bit less, certain, and try to invite people into a conversation, towards more questioning the reasoning that people have for certain decisions and beliefs that they have, to the point where they have to start explaining why they believe something, instead of just treating it as doctrine, like, yeah, I feel this way and that's the whole story. Because as you can imagine, this is not going to work. That isn't really, it's a very poor position to have. So if you start introducing the idea of, well, actually this is not correct and this is not correct and there's another way of thinking here, how do you feel about these things? Now you're breaking away the idea that someone is right just because they're the boss or because they're the senior or something like that. Now they have to prove their reasoning behind what they believe. Be careful here, guys. Some people really don't like this, and it can be dangerous, but it also, I've found, the most effective way to get other people away from this idea that, oh yeah, that is like Jane or Bob, like they've been here for so long and they're super, super good, and like that's why we should always do what they say. And I go, no, actually, you think that they are all this and so forth because you haven't taken the time to actually listen to why they think certain things work in a certain way. And if you just take the time to listen to that, either they are correct and their reasoning is really good, or more times than not, they're actually just a person with a really strong opinion that you are listening to because you think that they are the smartest person in the room. Have a great day.